African Ascent, I must say, is so spoiled that it has become accustomed to attracting the best, the brightest, and the authentically integrated individuals around metropolitan Boston. For the constant and consistent viewers of the program, I'm sure that you all remember this particular intense face who specializes in the study of art. African Ascent then is really delighted to bring you for the third time, because he's so good, Professor Rrof Bressler from Berklee Community College, Berklee College of Music. What a mistake. Berklee Community College is hardly a community college. It is in fact considered to be the leading college for the study of contemporary music. In the first two shows that Professor Bressler has done for African Ascent, he was sufficiently gracious to have agreed to cover some of the most complex facets of the art world today. In our first program, he ventured into discussing in great meticulous details the cultures at the Museum of Fine Art, in which he took his time and introduced my viewing public to some of the great art objects that the Museum of Fine Art hosts. I remember, for example, having asked him some very, very difficult questions about Egyptian art, and I remember how masterful, exhilarating, and important his presentations were. I remember as well having received something like 75 email responses to that stellar performance of his. Stimulated by that and to the benefit of African Ascent, which, as I said in the opening remark, is so spoiled because it attracts the brightest and the best, I invited him to speak one more time on art. And that time, the presentation was even more stellar. We delved into discussing some of the most fascinating facets of the art world, namely the question of authenticity. The viewing public was so interested in that episode that I was encouraged to invite him for the third time. And this time, mind you, he's going to link the discussions of authenticity to some of the most important and controversial themes in artwork, namely the question of crimes and theft. On my way here, I asked him what we should call this the particular presentation, and he was generous to have suggested a very philosophically intriguing topic. He wanted to link the concerns of the second episode, namely the discussions of authenticity, with that of theft. Welcome to African Ascent, and before I stop introducing him, I would like my viewers to remember that he's a graduate of Indiana University, in which he did a BA and a PhD at Boston University, and most importantly, only recently, about a year ago, he was honored with one of the most distinguished teaching awards that the Berklee College of Music gives. It chose him as one of its best professors in the liberal arts the department there. I would like to take this time to congratulate him and tell him how proud I am to be his colleague.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to African Ascent.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me again for time number 3.
So this time, I really want you to lead the show. We're going to do this somewhat differently. It will not be done in the answer and question format because you have so much to say. So what I think we should do is we should concentrate on these two landmark cases that you've decided to address yourself to, namely the famous thefts that took place at the Gardner Museum, and also the case of John Pollock, the famous 20th century, is it 20th century? African-American American artist, and the fate of his artwork. So why don't you briefly talk about these two cases and why you think they are important for us to devote one whole hour to them.
Okay. Well, I thought that for today that we could focus on 2 case studies, and as you'll see as we go through, and then based on the questions that you have for me, that sort of choosing these two case studies was a way of engaging lots of different issues, many of which interpenetrate. That is, when we're thinking we're having a conversation just about theft, we're really having a conversation of about 10 different things simultaneously. So what I would like to do is start off by talking a little bit about the 1990 Isabella Stewart Gardner heist. This is now 21 years ago, and then sort of use that as an opportunity of talking about why people steal things, and sort of use that as an opportunity of linking in a conversation about the sort of motivation for theft and the enormous value that are placed on the objects that we're going to be talking about today, and the sort of attendant responsibility that that places on the art world, both in terms of art connoisseurs, people who work in auction houses and museums, but also the prominent role that science plays in determining the authenticity of an object or the authorship of an object, which in some cases are not the same. So it sounds like a fairly wide-ranging set of conversations, and so we're going to try to make this concise and link these together in a way that makes sense. I think what got me sort of thinking about these issues for today are really two things. One, as I think I let you know, and the last time I was here, I'm in the middle of offering a course at Berklee, which is in its maiden voyage, that is focusing specifically on issues of theft and forgery and vandalism in the history of arts. And so these are issues that I've been thinking a lot about lately. At the same time, with the recent capture of Whitey Bulger, the Gardner theft has now come back into view in a little bit more detail. There is some suggestion that Whitey Bulger may have been in some way linked to the Isabella Stewart Gardner heist. For those of you who are not familiar with what happened, on March the 18th in the year of 1990, this is right during the big celebrations for St. Patrick's Day. This was most likely deliberate. As anyone who has lived in this town for any length of time knows, St. Patrick's Day is a fairly boisterous evening in and around the greater Boston area. And at about 1 o'clock in the morning, two thieves dressed as policemen came to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which is a private museum just down the street from the Museum of Fine Arts on the Fens. This was a museum that was built as a house for Isabella Stewart Gardner. It is, in many respects, a unique institution, and that is a collection built entirely by one person. Every single object that is in that museum was collected by Isabella Gardner in the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. She then presented this museum, which was actually her house, as a gift to the city of Boston as a museum in perpetuity. In 1990, two thieves, as I said before, dressed as policemen, banged on the side door of the museum, said that there was an emergency, they needed to be let in. The guards, going against rule number 1 for museum guards, which is never let anybody inside the museum, let the policemen in. They very quickly tied the two guards who were there up with duct tape in the basement, and then spent about an hour inside of the museum, where they removed 13 objects, including some of the most valued objects not only in Boston but in the United States, one of whom we're going to have on the screen for all of you, which is a painting by the 17th century Dutch artist Johannes Vermeer, a painting known as The Concert. There are only some, maybe 35 known Vermeers in the world today, so they're extraordinarily valuable, extraordinarily rare. Among the other objects that were taken were the only known seascape by Rembrandt, Van Rijn, another 17th century Dutch painter, a double portrait by Rembrandt, a small self-portrait etching by Rembrandt, 5 Degas drawings. Oh, there is the Vermeer over there. Fantastic. This is Vermeer's Concert. Several drawings by Degas, a painting by Manet, and then a couple of random objects, a little sort of finial from a Napoleonic flag and a 2,000-year-old Chinese beaker. Since 1990, the FBI and the museum have had hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of leads as to who took these things and why they took them. And as we sit here today, they are still missing, and we still don't know where they are, and we still don't really know a whole lot about who took them. You know, because this is local, I thought that this would be a subject of interest to you and to your readers. You can still go today, excuse me, to your viewers. And if you haven't been to the Gardner Museum before, it is one of the single most incredible interior spaces anywhere in the United States, certainly here in Boston. For all of you students watching out there, I think it's only $4 with your student ID to go to the Gardner Museum. You can also get in for free if your name is Isabella. And what I just learned, a little secret for all of you, is that Isabella Gardner, who was a big Red Sox fan, even in the early 20th century, apparently built into the museum's admission policies is that if you wear a piece of Red Sox paraphernalia, you get $2 off your admission.
Incredible.
A little something for you. So, using the Gardner heist as a pathway into a lot of other complex issues. And number one is, what are you going to do with a Vermeer painting, right? I mean, the concert by Vermeer, which your viewers were looking at a moment ago, is not only one of the most valuable paintings to exist on the face of the planet while it was in the museum. Now that it's gone, it's even more so, right? This is now an image that has been splashed on TV screens and in newspapers all over the world in the last 21 years. And the question is, if you have it, what are you going to do with it? What is the market for the theft of these stolen objects? What is the end goal for thieves when they take things that are extraordinarily expensive and, by extension, things that are extraordinarily well known? And this is a really challenging question to answer. There's a mythology that sort of entered into our popular culture that somewhere out there is a wealthy industrialist who in his basement has some secret wooden panels, and he goes down into his basement and he gets himself a glass of brandy and he opens it up and there's the Vermeer, and he sits there and thinks, I am the only one on the face of the planet who can look at this. This has been more or less shown to be complete fiction, that in all of the history that we know of famous stolen objects, that person does not exist. And one of the interesting things is that because there continues to be a sort of reaffirmation in popular culture and film of these wealthy collectors who steal these things on order, it has done nothing but spur additional thefts to happen, even though that market, in fact, does not exist. And in the literature, this is often referred to as the Dr. No effect. And the reason why it's known as the Dr. No effect is in the first James Bond movie that stars Sean Connery. There's this wonderful scene where he walks into the criminal lair of Dr. No, right, the great evil villain of the first James Bond movie. And as he's in the evil lair of Dr. No, he's wandering through his basement, and all of a sudden, he walks by a painting, Sean Connery in the film. And he walks straight by it, and then he stops. And he walks back 2 steps, and he takes another look at it. And he stares there for about 2 seconds, and he continues on. Well, it turns out that the painting that he was looking at was a painting by the Spanish artist Francisco de Goya of the Duke of Wellington. And that painting had just been stolen from the National Gallery in London in 1961. And the film was made in 1962. And so it was this kind of cheeky way for the film directors to include this little bit as the painting was still missing. And that in and of itself has an interesting story, which I'll bore your viewers with, as it begins to outline some of the reasons why people take things. And certainly the idea that there is a mystery Dr. No collector has been disproven. The Goya painting, which again is in Dr. No, which is how this sort of Dr. No mythology happens, was stolen in 1961, and the painting had been owned by a British lord who sold it to a wealthy American industrialist. And it was the policy of the British government, and still is to the best of my knowledge, that the government of Britain should have the opportunity of purchasing for Britain objects that go up for sale. That is, that they can match the price of objects that go up for sale to private individuals. And if they can match the price, then those will enter into the national collections of Britain. And so the money was raised by the government of Britain to buy this painting by Francisco de Goya of the Duke of Wellington, who's a great hero from the Napoleonic Wars. It's on display in the National Gallery to great fanfare for 3 weeks, and then they come one morning and it's gone. They start getting ransom letters, and the ransom letters they got were very strange. The ransom letters essentially said, I will return the Goya painting if you spend the same amount of money that you just spent to keep this painting in Britain on eliminating the tax for television that pensioners have to pay in Britain.
I see.
That is, old age pensioners had to pay a television tax. And this person who stole the painting thought that it was unfair that he would have to pay these television taxes while the British government was spending money on works of art. And the government thought that it was a hoax. A series of other letters came in also demanding these television taxes to be repealed. Nothing happens. And finally, about 4 years later, the painting ended up in a bus depot and given back to the museum. And finally, someone turned themselves in. He was 70 years old, retired bus driver, about the least likely person you would imagine of someone who would unscrew the bolts on a window in the bathroom of the National Gallery, sneak in to steal the painting for political reasons. And he ended up being acquitted of stealing the painting. It was a guy by the name of Kempton Bunton. He was ended up being acquitted for stealing the painting because there was this very arcane law in Britain in the late 60s that is no longer the case, where you could not be prosecuted for theft if it was always your intention to return the object that you had taken.
Okay, let me interrupt you now. I'm so fascinated. Several questions are just going through my mind. The first is this. I want to understand the mindset of a typical thief.
Okay.
What is this thief thinking? Because clearly, focusing on stealing something as spectacularly exorbitant as an art object is quite risky. Any person would have to say to himself, where am I going to take this? Who am I going to sell it to? What am I going to do with this? What am I burdening myself with? What will happen if I'm caught? What am I going to exchange this for? Why would any person consider stealing something as problematic as an art object?
Well, again, the answer to that question is as varied as the question is. And so we can sort of subdivide the way I'm going to answer this into several categories. One is, number one, there is no such thing as a Dr. No collector, right? That there is no mysterious billionaire who wants to own famous things in their basement. This does not exist, even though our popular culture continues to sort of reinforce the idea that that exists, which helps to create an environment where criminals who watch the same movies that you and I do think that that exists. So that's number one. Number two is we do have documented examples like the strange Kempton Bunton case that we were just talking about of people who steal objects for what we can consider to be sort of political reasons.
I see.
That's one example. In the mid-70s, there was an estate in England that was robbed by members of the Irish Republican Army. And they ransomed back the painting, and including a Vermeer, right? It's like the concert painting that we were looking at before from the Gardner Museum. And the paintings were ransomed back, number one, for money, and number two, for the release of political prisoners, that we will return this painting for X amount of money and for the release of these three political activists. So there are some cases where we have things that are being taken for political reasons. We have other cases where objects are taken by criminals for their own use in terms of barter. I'll give you one example, which is also local, which is here at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. There was a Rembrandt painting that was stolen in 1975 by a guy by the name of Miles Connor, who is related to the Gardner case, which we can get into if we go in that direction, who essentially had an indictment against him pending. And he asked his lawyer to talk to the prosecution about what he could do, right, as a way of reducing his sentence.
That's right.
And they said, well, you know, if you had any information about other stolen objects. I said, well, what kind of stolen object would I need to really bother my wife? I said, well, maybe if you had something like a Rembrandt. And so he went out and stole a Rembrandt from the MFA.
Literally stole it.
Literally stole a Rembrandt, right? And, you know, one of the other fictions, and then we'll sort of link this back into why people do it, and especially comes from film, as, you know, we have these images of people rappelling in black clothes down through the ceiling vent and diving under laser lights and things like that to steal paintings and objects from museums. And in most cases, they're essentially smash and grab. In the case of the Miles Connor, a truck pulled up into the back of the museum. He went in with two accomplices. The accomplices grabbed the guards. He grabbed the Rembrandt off the wall and ran out the back door into the van and was gone. And later used that painting to reduce his sentence. And so we have some cases where objects are taken to affect change in the lives of the criminals themselves or their compatriots that may be in prison. We'll return these paintings from the Gardner Museum if you release these people who are colleagues of mine out of prison, that sort of thing. In other cases, we have examples of stolen works of art, especially of enormous value, like the ones that we're talking about, and like your question has sort of directly sort of put on the table. These things being used as barter for sort of underworld transactions. So, and based on the information that we have from criminals who've been caught, that objects on the black market tend to have between, I think, a 5 to 7% value of their estimated auction value. And so they can be used essentially like gold bullion. And in the same way as that if I had a brick of gold sitting here on the table, it's worth something because it's gold. It's not something that I'm going to chop up into coins and go and use. Right? It's something that just the ownership of it retains a certain value, and that can be used. So we have certain cases, for example, of paintings that have been traded for loans to buy drugs, in certain cases paintings or sculptures that have been stolen to buy drugs directly. And these things change hands very frequently and are used sort of internationally. There are other extraordinarily distressing cases, and you see this mostly or primarily in sculpture, where objects are taken because of the base value of the materials out of which they're made. So, for example, today, bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, is a relatively expensive metal. And there are several cases in recent, and we're talking the last 2 or 3 years, of enormous bronze statues stolen by famous both contemporary and historical artists that are stolen so that they can be melted down.
Wow.
And then have their base materials used for cash. And so there's a fairly wide range of why these things are taken. For the most part, things are taken to be ransomed back to the museums. That is, overwhelmingly the intent of the thieves, as best as we can understand. We will give you back your Rembrandt if you give us $1 million. We will give you back your Vermeer if you give us $200,000 or whatever the number is. And that can be something that's a little bit difficult to track, as most institutions, public and private, if they receive ransom notices, if they end up paying them, which we know happens, generally those are things that are kept out of the papers and out of the general press, for fear that it would encourage other thieves to continue to do the same thing. And so we have several documented cases of stolen paintings or examples of decorative arts or of sculpture that are found in unlocked cars across the street from the museum a month after they're stolen. Wow. Meaning that at some point behind the scenes there has been a transaction that has been made and the objects have been returned. Okay. And so it's a real mosaic of why things are taken, and I think that for to sort of how all of that relates back to the Gardner heist.
That's what I want us to come back to.
The idea, right now, those things can do nothing but be ransomed back to the museum. The original reward was set at $1 million for information leading to the recovery of the paintings. As of the 20-year anniversary of the heist, that was up to $5 million. And so the Gardner Museum hopes that through a combination of the reward money that is out there for information leading to the recovery of the paintings, and also as now it's been 21 years, the idea that either the spouse of someone who was involved or the children of someone who was involved or the most likely ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend of the people who were involved are eventually going to lead authorities to finding these things.
Okay. Let me interrupt you briefly here. This may be somewhat outside of your territory, but I'm sure you have some...
You have such little faith in my territory,
That's
Teodros.
Right. What fascinated me about the Gardner episode is this. I watched the video that you sent me with great interest. What I learned from watching that event is how simple it seems to steal something as important as these art objects. Why is it so simple?
It is.
What is good?
Well, and certainly security at museums and private collections has evolved since 1990, but it's very expensive to properly not only protect these things, but museums have a very challenging mission that they have to navigate. And the primary mission is to get people into their institutions to look at these things. That this fundamental core
That's
belief that this is a...
They're not thinking more about protection.
Right, this is an essential part of what makes us a civilized species.
I see.
And so the more security that you place on these, putting objects behind layers of glass, putting objects behind barriers, sort of runs counter to those missions. And so finding the right way to navigate between keeping them safe but keeping them accessible continues to be an issue. You know, in the Gardner Museum, and this is a sort of a black mark on the institution that Teodros and I work for, you know, in 1990, the people who are working the night shift at that museum are college kids, right? One of them's from Berklee, right? You know, here you place these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids in charge of a literally priceless collection of objects.
Absolutely.
Through the middle of the night. It's expensive to hire trained guards and have them work 24 hours a day. A lot of the camera systems that they now have were not in place. And you know, certainly the museum world learns a lot from thefts. The problem is that, and all museum security heads would agree with this, if you really want to take something and you're willing to go to great lengths to do it, the museum is not a bank vault, right? And if you want to go in with a gun, this is not a how-to program, kids out there, this is something that there's very little that museum security can do. There are steps that they can take in terms of guard training, in terms of access to exits from the galleries and things like that. And unfortunately, Massachusetts, where we all are living and probably watching, has been an unfortunate trendsetter in art theft. The first ever armed robbery of a museum happened in Massachusetts, which is at the Worcester Art Museum, which involved another theft of a Rembrandt, 3 Rembrandts stolen from the Gardner Museum, a Rembrandt stolen from the MFA, and then this Rembrandt that was stolen from the Worcester Art Museum by
Rembrandt only?
Well, I can summarize. Well, I think that the best way of answering that, and not to evade your question, there's just a recent book that just was published 2 weeks ago, which is a fabulous, fabulous read. I've just finished it, which is written by the head of security at the Gardner Museum, Anthony Amore, and a journalist from the Boston Herald named Tom Mashberg. And the book is called Stealing Rembrandts. And it is a look into, and very, very well written and easy to, I mean, it's written for a popular audience, so it's very easily accessible, and looks at the history of Rembrandt theft all over the world, and also dives into the idea of why Rembrandt. And this would actually be an interesting way for us to transition into another topic, because you know, and it's interesting when I teach Rembrandt in class, as I do at Berklee. You know, I'm sitting in front of a classroom of 40 kids, and I'll say, Rembrandt. Has anyone in this room heard of Rembrandt? Everyone's heard of Rembrandt. This is a name that screams painting, good painting, valuable painting, important painting.
You'd say more than Van Gogh or Gauguin.
Yes, as a name that by itself stands for greatness. Rembrandt is up there with all of them. And the interesting thing about Rembrandt, among the millions of things that are of interest about Rembrandt, is that when I ask the second question to students, okay, everyone's heard of Rembrandt. Okay, name one painting.
They don't know any single one.
They can't name a single painting.
Remarkable.
And it's interesting, and I don't mean that as a way of saying, you know, saying bad things about our students, because they're fabulous. But it is a testament to, in many respects, how marketing is of extraordinary importance in the visual arts and the way that it is in music as well, right? And this is something that you know, I talk to my students at great length about, where the idea that something is important, right, is of equal importance to whatever it is that person is doing. Sort of perceived greatness is of equal, if not more importance than objective greatness.
Then
we can even figure out what that is.
What should at this moment is give the viewers a brief summary of this stellar performance on authenticity that you focused on in our second conversation, so that we can move.
Excellent. But before we leave that, I just wanted to make sure that I can sort of bring all of this together, as we've covered a lot of areas. And so the argument that we're trying to make here, and using the Gardner theft as the case study, is to sort of lay out the different ways in which works of art that are taken can be used. And there are certain sort of categories that we can call out of the experiences that we've had, whether it be in some examples of some kind of political motivation, some examples of sort of barter for thieves for their own sort of benefit in terms of reduced jail sentence. Mostly things occur for ransom back to institutions. And again, it's more difficult for us to track those things because so many of those transactions happen behind the scenes and are not made public. The sort of the end story of the Gardner case is that now, because of how famous those things are, it continues to restrict for the thieves who have them what they can actually do with them, because of the widespread nature with which those things have been advertised and splashed all over the place, and with the high dollar value that's been attached onto the ransom. And so how we can use those conversations as a sort of connective element to talking about authenticity is, much to your question about why Rembrandt. Well, Rembrandt, even if you don't know anything about painting, you can say that museum has got a Rembrandt in it. And I don't know if it's from his early period or from his late period. I don't know if it's a really good Rembrandt or a bad Rembrandt, but it's a Rembrandt. And if I'm going to go take something, I'm going to take a Rembrandt. And the question of how we figure out what is a Rembrandt and what isn't is in and of itself a really interesting topic that I would like to sort of move to now as it relates to things that we have talked about. And I'll start with Rembrandt, and then we'll move into the Jackson Pollock example.
That's
I know
right.
we brought something in.
That's right.
Rembrandt is, as we've mentioned, probably one of the most recognizable names in the history of Western painting and also of printmaking. And how many Rembrandts there are, like if we were to put all the Rembrandt, we'll just deal with paintings in a box, right, and say how many Rembrandts are there. That number has changed quite dramatically in the last 100 years. If you would have asked this question in 1930, the answer would have been about 500. Right? That's sort of in 1931 or so, 500 paintings by Rembrandt on the planet. If you ask that question, authenticated Rembrandts. If you ask that question today, the number is closer to around 230. Right? That number has been cut in half. And the way that it has been cut in half is really interesting, right? And that how do we determine when we're looking at an object whether it is authentic or not? And there are many things that we bring to the table. One is science, right? And now we have continued to, in the scientific sphere, develop new ways of testing objects to determine their authenticity. And you can do things like testing the wood to see how old it is. We can use dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings, for example, to tell when the tree was felled that provided the wood for the painting, and that can be something that can tell us. We can test the pigments, right, the types of colors that the artist is using, and make sure that all of the pigments that are in a 17th century object would have been available in the 17th century. Are there synthetic pigments that shouldn't be there that weren't invented till the 19th century? All that stuff we can test. And scientists have a whole array of things they can do. If everything tests out, right, and everything looks good and it smells like the 17th century and it dates to the 17th century and the paint is to the 17th century and that's all good, still doesn't tell you if you're dealing with a Rembrandt. Right? That's when the art historians come in and say, all right, does this look like a Rembrandt? Does it feel like a Rembrandt? Is this the way that he painted ears in the 1640s? Is this the signature that he would have used in 1637? Or is that before he switches over to that signature? And a lot of that game is extraordinarily subjective. And the stakes are enormous. Right? And related to why people take things, in our first part of the conversation, well, they take them because they're expensive. I mean, I think that the current standing winner, if you want to think about it in those terms, of the most expensive object ever sold was a Jackson Pollock painting. And it was sold about 4 years ago for $141 million for a single object. Yeah, and everyone in the studio is going, damn, right. This is big stakes, right? And so the question of whether something is a Rembrandt or not, or something is a Jackson Pollock or not, is big, big, big stakes, right? And so here on the screen, thank you, is what is perhaps a Jackson Pollock painting. And the woman who is standing next to that Jackson Pollock painting is a fabulous woman who's still with us by the name of Terry Horton, who is a retired truck driver, who bought this painting in a thrift shop for $5. Right?
$5.
$5.
At a thrift shop.
At a thrift store.
Who didn't
right?
know what she was buying?
Absolutely no idea what it was buying. She bought it because it had lots of colors. She thought a friend of hers would like it for her birthday. She was unable, she was a truck driver, so she was able to fit it in her truck, got to her friend's house. The painting wouldn't fit through the door of her friend's house, so she decided to keep it. And suddenly she became convinced that, well, maybe someone had seen it and said, you know, that sort of looks like Jackson Pollock, right? Probably the most well-known American artist of the 20th century, abstract expressionist, extraordinarily famous, and as I've just mentioned, extraordinarily valuable. No one believes her. Right? She tried very hard to get art experts to look at this painting and say that it was a Jackson Pollock. And the first question that they asked her was, where did you get it? And the answer was, in a thrift shop.
In a thrift shop.
And for most people, that is the end of that conversation.
Of
right?
course.
And this is not, I don't mean to make that sound superficial. I mean, one of the things that is of enormous importance when we try to reconstruct the history of objects, not just in terms of buying and selling, but in terms of placing them within their historical context, is what is called a painting's provenance, or an object's provenance. And a provenance is the documented history of the object. And if we're lucky, we can document a history of that object all the way back to the time of its creation.
I see.
So, for example, we can take something like the Mona Lisa.
Okay.
And the Mona Lisa, we know, is painted by Leonardo in the early 16th century. He takes it with him to France, where it's sold to the King of France, Francis I, in the first decade of the 16th century, and it's never left the Louvre. I mean, besides when it was stolen, but that's a whole other story. And so, you know, we have a clear documented history of this object that we can trace back to the artist who created it. So when you have something like the image that we just looked at that has no history, this is a really dangerous thing for art experts, for auction houses, for potential purchasers. You know, Jackson Pollocks don't just fall from the sky, and they certainly don't come from thrift stores. So where it comes from is problem number one. Problem number two, frankly, is the person who found it. And in an art world that is a very insulated environment, the idea that this foul-mouthed 70-year-old grandma trucker has a Jackson Pollock painting that she found in a thrift store sort of adds to the unbelievability of the painting. There's a documentary which I can recommend to everyone who's watching about this story that's called Who the Bleep is Jackson Pollock, that came out about 5 years ago, that traces the history that I'm going to summarize and brief for you. And all of the art experts, essentially, not just because it has no provenance and not just because of who has delivered it, but also because they didn't like the painting. And I don't mean that they didn't like the colors, but that it didn't feel to them like a Jackson Pollock. That is, the aesthetics of how it was painted, according to the Pollock experts, did not seem consistent with Pollock's painting.
I see.
So Terry Horton is not she's not going to give up. She's going to continue to try and argue that this is a Jackson Pollock painting. And so she finds herself online discovering a Canadian scientist, a guy by the name of Peter Paul Biro. And Peter Paul Biro was just beginning a new specialty within the authentication of objects, where he would find fingerprints that were left on paintings of well-known artists, and then take very, very, very sort of microscopic, up-close photographs of these fingerprints and digitize them using a technology that he invented, according to Peter Paul Biro, and that he wouldn't share with anyone this technology that he invented. And then he was able to match fingerprints from known objects by well-known artists to fingerprints that he would find on newly discovered objects that were purported to be by the same person. That is, no longer would we have to rely solely upon the judgment of an art expert who says this doesn't feel like a Jackson Pollock or a Leonardo da Vinci or a Michelangelo, because now we can use, you know, CSI technology and find fingerprint here and fingerprint there. And so he does a study of this Jackson Pollock painting of Terry Horton and finds a fingerprint on the back of it. And says, okay, this painting has a fingerprint. Now what he needs to find is a Jackson Pollock fingerprint. And so Jackson Pollock, who was never arrested, he was never in the army, we don't have his fingerprints on file. So Biro does the next best thing, which he visits this Jackson Pollock studio, which is preserved as a museum in New York. And right there on a paint can, right, in the museum, you know, 50 years after Pollock's death, he finds a fingerprint. Right? Wow. Takes a photograph of the fingerprint, digitizes it, and matches it up to Terry Horton's painting. Right? So here we have incontrovertible proof goes the argument that Jackson Pollock is the fingerprints on the paint can, and here the fingerprint is on the painting. Terry Horton wins. The good guy wins. The little guy has, stuck it to the elitist, nose in the air art world. And it would be great if that were the story. And if we could just be done now, and thank you for having me, Teodros. It's not quite that simple, however. As it turns out, and this is all within the past couple of years that this has happened, that it turns out that the fingerprints that he found on this supposed Jackson Pollock painting may not have actually been there originally when he got the painting.
I see.
And that Peter Paul Biro, who has since gone to use this single fingerprint as a way of authenticating other Jackson Pollock paintings, that these fingerprints have now been looked at by other experts, and it seems that he is now using the same fingerprint for all of these Jackson Pollock paintings.
Amazing.
So meaning that there is a great likelihood that fingerprints are being forged or being placed deliberately on objects that did not have them so that they can be authenticated as being by artists who they are not by.
That's what I was thinking, as a matter of fact. I hesitated a bit to ask this, thinking that it may be implicitly silly. But now that you have thought of it, let me ask it this way. How do I know that literally any finger painting on any art object is real?
Well, I mean, there is, I'll say two things. The possibility that these fingerprints were faked is something that was published in a New Yorker article from last year. As we sit here right now, the scientist Peter Paul Biro has just in the past 2 weeks filed a lawsuit against the New Yorker magazine, saying that his character has been defamed by the way that this story has been treated in the New Yorker. And so there's still part of this story that is yet to be written. But to directly engage your question, the answer is we don't know. Right?
We really don't.
And one of the interesting things that comes out of all of these conversations is that the idea that says that the traditional ways that paintings would be attributed, or sculpture for that matter, would be by experts who have spent their lives looking at Rembrandt, at Leonardo, at Jackson Pollock, at Andy Warhol, at whoever, and then are presented with something discovered or new, and based on their experience would say, it doesn't feel right, or it does, or this is something that fits right into this part of their career, or it doesn't. And at the end of the day, that is a very subjective, right, although informed by the expert, but at the end of the day, a subjective enterprise, right? That in my opinion, based on years of study,
that's right,
it is of my, sort of scholarly opinion that this is not, or it is. The idea that science is the antidote to that, where we have sort of what in the sort of art history business we would call connoisseurship, right? That the antidote to that is science, right? That this is objective, right? That somehow now that we have all of these scientific tools, it can tell us definitively the answer. Right? So even with, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but even with the fingerprints, where we can look, and Biro was also involved in the authentication of a new Leonardo drawing that has been uncovered. And he went to the Vatican Museum. There's a painting of St. Jerome by Leonardo that we know is by Leonardo that's in the Vatican. And he found a fingerprint on that painting that then he found also on this Leonardo drawing. And whether or not the fingerprint is Leonardo's is also something that we don't know.
Absolutely.
And so, science is wonderful, and science does, I think a good way of thinking about it is that science does a very good job of telling us what something is not. Right? That is, if you're trying to tell me that a painting is from the 17th century, that it was made in 1620, and it's covered in blue paint that was invented in 1910, it ain't from the 17th century. Science can tell me definitively, right, that you are not looking at something that is 350 years old. Science is very challenging for counting things in, right? That is, for saying that is a Rembrandt or a Leonardo, or in this case, a Jackson Pollock, right? That science is can only help us so much in telling us what something is. It is really helpful in telling us what things are not.
Okay. What I liked about your response is the clarity of it. But I'm thinking of what you just told me in two ways now. In the first instance, we're at the mercy of the authenticity of the real, of the original fingerprinting, against which future fingerprints are going to be measured. In the second case, we're at the mercy of science. In both cases, it appears as if we are hampered by possibilities over which we have no control. So in the end, there is nothing that guarantees that all these great art objects that we see at the museum are in the end the real things.
Well, I think that I would engage that in two ways. I mean, number one, I think that the difficulty that we have inherited and the difficulty that we will always have, and in the examples that you were using of sort of fingerprints and science as being sort of two separate avenues, I would sort of lump those together in one.
Would you?
Right. That is that we have what our tools can tell us about the physical things that are in front of us, and whether that's fingerprint digitization or whether that's infrared reflectography or thermoluminescence, I mean, like whatever, you know, all of these sort of barrage of tools that we have scientifically. And so that's one sort of element that helps us a lot, that helps us to determine not only things that are sort of black and white, is it fake or is it real, but there's a lot of nuances that go on there. A painting that was made in the 16th century, that was repainted in the 17th, lost part of its surface, restored in the 19th, touched up a little bit in the early 20th century. Well, what is that? You know, science can tell us the layers of that.
That's right.
Right? That they can say, this is something that was added then. It doesn't make it fake, and it doesn't make it inauthentic. It makes it layered, which in the vast majority of cases, it's not so black and white. It's much more complex. And so, you know, science has done amazing things for our understanding of not only authenticity versus inauthenticity, but about things like working process, how the artist laid on their pigments, the choices that sculptors made for their tools based on our ability to, you know, to use these new devices that we have at our disposal. But I think that the more sort of pressing issue is, and I'll use an example that I know that I brought up last time as a way of sort of bringing all of this together. Which is a very famous case of the Dutch forger Hans van Meegeren that we talked about last time, and who was arrested for selling Vermeer paintings to the Nazis, and during the 30s, and after the war was over, he's put on trial for selling off Vermeers to the Nazis. His defense is that he painted them himself.
Yes.
Right? And so we talked about this. But there's one quote from his trial, from the Van Meegeren trial, that I think brings all of this together.
I think so.
And he says, here is this painting that I made. Right? Yesterday, this was considered to be a masterpiece, and people would have paid millions of guilders for this painting. Today, it is worthless, and you would not pay a cent to go and see it across the street. The object has stayed exactly the same. But what's changed?
Our perceptions of it have changed.
And it's really interesting when you think about it in those terms. And you know, when you go to the museum, and you know, we could all take a field trip to the MFA and look at the several Rembrandts, for example, that are there. And if you look at the museum label and it says Rembrandt, period, full stop, we're influenced by that when we look at what's in front of us. If it says Rembrandt, question mark, next to it, or Rembrandt, circle, next to it. Nice. Someone who sort of knew Rembrandt or was trained Rembrandt. Right. It not only affects the price of that object, right? I mean, we're talking the difference. I'll give you one example in the reverse of a painting that was thought to be maybe by Rembrandt, that was valued at around $110,000 in a museum in Holland, that was then determined to be by Rembrandt, and is now worth $11.5 million overnight. Right? And so what that tells us about ourselves when we look at something, what our expectations are in many cases divorced from the actual thing that we're looking at, but by the perceived context of who has created that object, what role that artist plays in our popular culture and in the way we think about greatness over time.
I appreciate the response. And now, one final question. I'm intrigued by this. from what I studied about the Gardner Museum case, which I stated earlier, is how simple it is to steal. But at the same time, I'm wondering now, and I'm sure you are also, why it is so difficult to recover these stolen objects. Why has it taken over 21 years for these 13 spectacular art objects that were taken so simply, as if you had picked up a cup of tea from Starbucks without anybody watching you, because it's so easy to steal, but so difficult to recover them. Why is that?
Well, I think that at this point, even though the statute of limitations for the theft itself has passed, right? So technically, thieves can now not be arrested for the actual theft.
I see.
They can be arrested for being in possession knowingly of stolen objects, which is a different category. I think that what has most likely happened, and I repeat, this is subjective, viewers, I have no insight into this, it is not in my basement, is that the objects have been split up, that they probably exist in many different places all over the country, perhaps all over the world. And if you had a Vermeer in your basement, what do you do with it? I mean, truly, if you want to profit from it and you decide to cash in on the $5 million reward, how do you go about making that happen without being implicated as someone who is involved?
Absolutely.
I mean, you put yourself in a lot of danger even this far down the road as time has passed. I think that
these objects are somewhere sitting safely.
One would hope
it
does no one any good to destroy them. And I wish we had more time. I could tell you only one story that we know of. Actually, I could tell you two of examples that we have of objects that were stolen being destroyed as opposed to being returned. And these are extraordinarily seldom because it does no one any good whatsoever. It's like taking a bag full of money and burning it.
Because you can always keep it at home.
You can always keep it at home. You can always use it in these other contexts. It does you absolutely no good to destroy it.
You can keep it in the basement and
well, I mean, I think that the real concern, I know that we're probably done on time, is that the environmental conditions that are necessary to care for old objects are most likely not in people's basements or in the back of their car, where these things are probably located, or in trunks. And so the real fear is not that they are destroyed, but that they are damaged beyond repair.
Excellent.
And let's hope that's not the
We
case.
have about 2 minutes left, and as you know, my viewers are so spoiled by you. You have become this highly reliable art critic for Afghan Ascent, which I am very grateful for. And I'm sure the viewers would like to get some insights from you about this topic and other upcoming topics that we're going to cover in the future. What should they be looking for? What would it be coming back to discuss with us in the future?
Well, I guess you and I will have to talk about that. You know, as Teodros and I share. We are right next to each other on in our building at Berklee, colleagues and neighbors. There's no shortage of interesting topics to explore. This is an area that is extraordinarily interesting. It's relevant. It's in the newspaper all the time. I think that even for the casual viewer in this case, or the casual interested person, there's a lot of very rich stories here that tell us a lot about ourselves and the world that we live in.
Excellent. He's also the CEO of a famous program called Pro Arts Movement, about which we might possibly talk in the future. This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for African Ascent. Good evening.